Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this lovely afternoon. And we promise you another very insightful and interesting session as well with both my speakers. So today we're talking about reimagining global governance bodies and the future of COP and global efforts to tackle climate change. And of course, almost 30 years since the first COP, the world is asking, can our current climate governance structures keep up with the urgency of this crisis? There has been a lot of criticism towards COP in terms of pledges versus what is happening on the ground and actions being taken. So today, this is what we're going to be discussing. I'm happy to introduce our speakers, but I think it's more interesting if we hear from them. So please go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Perfect. Thank you for having me. I'm Sheikha Mohammed Sharif. On a day-to-day job, I'm a battery engineer at Masdar, the UAE's flagship renewable energy company. And seasonally, I'm a UAE climate negotiator following the tracks of response measures and just transition under the UNFCCC.
Hello, Sheikha. Please go ahead.
Thanks, me. Hi, everyone. I'm Nirnita Talukdar. I work as the Asia Pacific lead for UNEP FI, which is the UN Environment Program Finance Initiative. Maybe just very quickly to talk about UNEP FI. UNEP FI is an organization that works in partnership with the UN as well as the financial institutions. So as of today, we are working with more than 500 financial institutions in basically shaping what sustainability looks like and also supporting financial institutions in their sustainability journey. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I would like to start with you, Sheikha, and I know that you've been in the negotiating rooms and you've heard all types of negotiations around the pledges and the commitments and the actions being taken. In your mind, why is there a gap between what is being pledged and the actions taken on the ground?
That's a great question, and it's definitely expected. Just to give a quick overview on what you expect when you walk into a negotiating room, it's a multilateral process and it is party-driven. So it's not bilateral, it's multilateral. You have over 190 parties and need to come together within consensus. So it is consensus-driven. If 99% agree and one does not agree, you cannot come up with policy. And that's very important to keep in mind. The challenges that you see in a negotiating room is due to the fact that, and you should expect that, there are different parties, different regions, different geographies, different economical situations. It's a melting pot of national priorities and bottom lines. And these national priorities and these bottom or red lines do not necessarily overlap with one another. So you have a lot of areas of divergence. I remember when the UAE held presidency in COP28, one thing that the leadership really instilled in us is to ensure to really commit to looking at the areas of convergence. And if you really focus on the areas of convergence, that helps you understand what the areas of divergence really are, whether they could stem from things that are financial, technical, political, whatever they are. That's the way that you can perhaps, try to reach an agreement. And the UAE consensus, which was a very successful outcome of COP, is a testament to that, because we really focused on the areas of convergence and then build our way up into converging the areas of divergences.
That is very interesting indeed. So I want to come to you, Narnita, and if you can tell us, in your opinion, what institutional innovations are actually required to turn pledges into actions? What kind of policies, regulations, what do you want to see that, in your mind, in your opinion, will help close this gap?
Thanks. And I think maybe just coming back to the divergence part then, one thing that we are seeing more and more, at least again looking at Asia Pacific, is that we are coming out with a lot of taxonomies. And there's a lot of regulations that are coming out in terms of wood disclosures, as well as when we talk about sustainable finance. So I think what is really needed at this moment is a lot more interoperability. Again, with UNEP FI, we are working with a lot of different organizations to try and harmonize taxonomies. The other thing that I wanted to highlight out here is in terms of looking at the ASEAN taxonomy, because I think it's really interesting how it's a regional taxonomy, but it also is aligned with global standards. And at the same time, it is ensuring that it is providing that enabling environment for national, for countries to really align their national priorities with regional priorities. So I think looking at such things, ensuring that we are looking at a more harmonized regulatory landscape. I think the second thing that I would like to highlight out here is looking at data infrastructure. And it's very, very critical to have really viable data so that investors are able to really act on it. So yeah, I think these are the two gaps that would be important for us to be looking at.
And I think a part of the challenges come as well to the technical parts. And I know, Sheikha, that you're both an engineer and a negotiator as well. So when you think about energy storage, thermal solutions, I mean, these are technical realities at a time and at a place where COP is all about policy. So how do you turn these technical factors and this technical criteria into policies when you negotiate?
That's a perfect question. So the way I like to think about it is that the UNFCCC is like an umbrella of where we're moving within the climate scene. So if I speak on a national capacity as the UAE, and ironically enough, it gives me a guidance to what the next 5 years of my work is going to look like because I work in a renewable sector. So it is more of the high-level vision of where we want to go, and then what could we do to ensure that that is trickled down internally, whether it's on a national level, on a subnational level. And it's very important to ensure that the technical aspect is well incorporated. So when I'm in those negotiating rooms, even though I negotiate under just transition, which is more of a social aspect of the transition, there are parts of it that are interlinked with trade and the energy sector. So things that come in mind is, if we implement certain solutions, is it actually linked to the ground or not? We always hear about the call of ambition in the climate scene, but we need to make sure that that's grounded in reality. So if we come up with, for example, highly intermittent sources of energy, such as renewables, can the grid take it? Is it stable enough? So these are things that you take into account, and you try not to hinder the ambition, but rather sharpen it and make it more, ground-based and reality-based.
Okay, so we are living at a very interesting times with a lot of geopolitical tension happening around the globe. Governments have different priorities now. Most of them are focused around their economies and how to, keep driving their economic growth. So for them, this is the priority at a time where to actually turn the pledges into actions when it comes to climate change, you need capital. So to what extent, in your opinion, Narinta, when you look at that part, capital is really a critical part and a critical pillar when it comes to, turning these pledges into actions and seeing real work being done?
Yeah, I think for us to be actually looking at a transition, first and foremost, there needs to be both public sector involvement, and it's critical for private sector to really come forward. And so talking about the private sector a bit, again, I think especially when we're talking about emerging economies, when we're talking about Asia Pacific, just transition needs to be the center of our work when we are looking at transition. Again, emerging economies, or specifically out here looking at Asia Pacific, there is a lot of dependency on coal, high emitting sectors still. So how do you look at transition in a way that makes sense for the region, that makes sense in terms of your economic growth, but is also looking at long-term sustainability? I think that needs to be prioritized. So with UNEP-FI, we are working with financial institutions through two main frameworks, which is the Principles for Responsible Banking and the Principles for Sustainable Insurance. As a part of this work, we are actually working towards coming out with global guidances and global norms on how you can look at transition, how you can look at your sustainability objectives, which are aligned to global ambitions, but also really takes into account your national ambitions as well as your regional priorities. And I think that is critical when you're talking about ensuring that we are looking at mobilization of finance within the region or within emerging economies.
I like this term, unifying the practices and unifying the norms. So to what extent do you think, Sheikha, that this is really important, not only in terms of mobilizing capital, but in terms of keeping everybody on board when it comes to their commitments to climate change?
Yeah, that's a good aspect to look into. What she brought up, just transition. That's where a lot of the work I do in the UNFCCC centers. It's really important that, you know, a term that is under the UNFCCC is common but differentiated responsibilities, because climate change is a global crisis, but there are different responsibilities that lie on different parties. So if you have some privileges, you need to ensure that others are on board with you. And the UAE is a good example of that. You know, I could give a couple of examples about, for example, just about the work that I do in Masdar. We do ensure that once we implement renewable energy projects, it's not only about the profitability, but also onboarding others with us. So we do have a lot of South-South cooperation, ensuring that once we build those renewable plants for South-based countries, that they are trained, there is upskilling, there is capacity building, there is technologies transfer, and they are all involved in the process.
And I think this is important. You mentioned technology transfer and know-how transfer as well, and especially to emerging economies. So to what extent do you think, Nernita, that this is another factor that has to be taken into consideration by governments when they build renewable energy projects, big mega and giga projects, that it's not only about the profit, it's not only about climate change, but it's also about bringing other parties on board, as Sheikha was mentioning?
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially looking at capacity building, I think it's really, really critical. As I mentioned, that we're working with more than 500 financial institutions, and in Asia Pacific, we're working with more than 100 of them. And one of the things, and we do a number of surveys when we talk to our financial institutions, I think one of the things that we keep hearing more and more around is the need for really looking at capacity building. And also, when we are talking to regulators, etc., the same thing comes across. So how do you ensure that we are providing capacity building in a way that makes sense for the country, as well as we're also providing a capacity building hub that brings in policymakers as well as financial institutions together, so that there is also a dialogue between them. So this is very, very critical. And the second thing, just wanted to highlight in terms of South-South cooperation, again, this is a big, important factor. A lot of times when we're talking about sustainable finance, green financing, the definitions, etc., might be a little bit more aligned to developed countries in some ways, and it really is critical that we are aligning on what sustainable finance means or sustainability would mean for the South context.
Okay, so Sheikha, let me come to you with a question about UAE priorities and UAE agenda. You know, you've been in the negotiating rooms, and of course, we know about the UAE climate agenda. So to what extent do you think that it's easy for a country and for the government to actually balance between their ambitions and their commitments and their agenda to fight climate change?
So a good way to look about it, as I mentioned earlier, there are national contexts, whether it's economical, environmental, etc. So a country might thrive with renewable energy. The UAE, we have an abundance of solar power. So we could work with that. Other countries would work better with wind. We do not work as good as others with wind, for example. So it's a matter about understanding the diversity of, for example, your energy mix, and looking at ways where you can exemplify that by putting down policies that incentivizes those industries, but also ensures that you are on the right track towards net zero. And it's also about, you know, being very transparent internally, ensuring that those transparency reports reflect how far are you from your net zero goals and how can you collaborate and cooperate with others in order to reach it at a faster pace.
To what extent, Nernita, do you think that financial institutions should be in the negotiating rooms?
Oh, I think it's really, really important.
Why?
And it's very important that it starts at an early phase. a lot of the times countries come out with policies and then it's the financial institutions, for example, banks are supposed to implement the taxonomies, and there is such a huge gap. So I think it's really, really critical that financial institutions are a part of the early policy co-designing phase. I think, and we see that really happening right now. You see it in Japan when they're talking about transition finance. In India right now, the taxonomy is just coming out, and you're seeing that the Ministry of Finance has developed a working group with financial institutions and the Ministry of Finance coming together to really understand where the gaps are. I think the other thing is really ensuring that we are able to provide scalable pilots. And again, it's very, very critical because, sometimes before you make it mandatory, it's important to understand how things are actually phasing out. So for example, the Australia Sustainable Finance Institute has just come out with the Australia taxonomy. And I think, again, been very interesting to see that before they're making it mandatory, they've actually identified financial institutions in Australia that can take forward the taxonomy and see where the gaps are so that changes can be made accordingly. So, yeah.
So, Sheikha, you're both, of course, an engineer and a negotiator. So you combine negotiation skills with technical metrics. What would you like to see in COP30?
I think, to be very frank, there is a timeline where things become irreversible, and we're very close to that deadline. So we need to shift from being in a conceptual mindset to go through an implementation mindset. Being there for the call of ambition is great, as I mentioned earlier, with ensuring that you need to be grounded by reality, as in, are these high ambitions, linked to reality? Can you actually implement them? We need to have a collective shift as parties within the process, and even constituencies and NGOs, etc., to really move from that, high ambition but no implementation mindset. And the UAE, I could give a couple of examples on how we ensure that is really embedded in our national strategy. We have, for example, the renewable projects we work with the Global South. We also have Altera, which is a climate finance, private finance fund that is led by the UAE. There are multiple other initiatives, such as expanding energy access and energy security through Africa, such as Etihad 7. So this is a pathway, which is, an example that a lot of the parties can actually go through. And the UAE, after all, we're a small country. And if we're able to do it, given our national context and our geo-national context, I think a lot of parties can also, help one another and go through the same pathway.
So we were talking earlier about mobilizing capital, but I think the big question as well doesn't only have to do with mobilizing capital, but as well as distributing it in an equal manner. And Nurnita, in your mind, whose responsibility is that?
I don't think it's any one party's responsibility. Honestly, I think everyone needs to come together for this phase. So, of course, regulations need to be put in place, and regulatory bodies are very, very important for this. But it is, again, financial institutions. It's also the local stakeholders. Everyone really needs to come together, and it can be done in a myriad of ways. But coming back to what Sheikha was saying, that I think it's very critical, again, to be really ensuring that we're going beyond ambition. And just transition itself is, we can easily talk about it, but then it's actually very difficult when we talk about implementing it and ensuring that we are getting local stakeholders, we are getting vulnerable populations at the center of any discussions, at the center of any action on sustainable finance. So it's really important that different bodies come together, really understand what is needed, start piloting on the different ways that you can be looking at a transition that is inclusive and equitable, and work together towards the same.
I would love to hear your thoughts, Sheikha, on this topic. About the priority is not only about mobilizing capital, but as well as making sure that it's distributed in an equal manner.
Right. As she mentioned, it's a collective it's a collective issue. We should be all contributing, but we do also know, as I mentioned, common but differentiated responsibilities. That's why in the negotiations we have different negotiating groups. So we do not expect, for example, from the umbrella group or the G77 group, the same things we expect from the African group of countries, or, for example, the least developed countries, or the SIDS, the small island developing states who have limited resources. This is a good way to look about it, is to ensure that everyone is on board. And I like the mention of stakeholder involvement. Stakeholder involvement does not only rely on government, so it's not necessarily the people who make the legislation and the subnational entities. It's also about, the public sector, the private sector, trade organizations, financial institutions, the civil society, etc. It's ensuring everyone is on board, and also it's about the type of finance. So you want to ensure that the type of finance you get is a type of finance that is just, equitable, and fair in a manner that serves all of society.
So what do you do when, because we're talking about negotiations that happened with different countries, different governments, and with different financial resources, obviously. So what happens when you set the agenda that needs a higher commitment level that is not feasible for a certain country with limited finances and limited resources? I mean, when you set the agenda and the commitments, to what extent do you think that they are taking into consideration that not all countries are alike, whether in financial means or their priorities, financial priorities and economic priorities as well?
So this goes back to one of the first conversations that we've had. It's, we have had commitments, and it's important to move from the conceptual mindset to an implementation mindset, because we do have pledges, and we do have funds, and we do have dollars that have been announced, but where is it going, and to who, is how we need to frame it. And that framing has to be done as soon as possible in order to ensure that everyone is truly on board.
So I would love to hear your thoughts as well about regulations and policies, and to what extent do you think that they're taking into consideration the rapid progress we're seeing with climate finance and green finance?
I think, as I was mentioning, I think there has been a lot of movement in the regulatory landscape, especially in APAC. I think nearly every country right now either has more regulations in place when you're talking about disclosures. As I mentioned, taxonomies are really coming up. So there is obviously that movement, but I think it's also been interesting to see that private sector, and here I'm talking about financial institutions, have also been becoming even more ambitious at times than many countries with their ambition levels. So, for example, again, looking at APAC, as I mentioned, I'm working with more than 100 financial institutions in 15 countries. Of course, some of the financial institutions from some of the countries have really ambitious sustainable finance policies in place. But we also have financial institutions from countries where the sustainable finance policy landscape is still very niche. It's just starting out, but financial institutions have been quite ambitious in that sense. And I think, therefore, it's really important that when we're talking about this, it's critical that be it financial institutions, be it private sector players or other actors, they really understand what their national ambitions looks like and try and align as much as possible with the global agenda, but really look at what their impact is going to look like, be it on the environment and society. And that is only possible when you're looking at your national objectives, you're looking at your own portfolio, etc.
But for financial institutions, it's only about the P&L. It's about the profit and loss. It's about the return on investments and IRRs. So to what extent do you think that their priorities are shifting fast enough to look at the bigger picture of green finance? I've worked for a financial institution before, and I know that when we are presented with a project, it's not really about whether its purpose is about fighting climate change, or how it's about sustainable energy or renewables. It's about how much money does this project make, and to what extent is it enough to cover the borrowing cost and the principal amount of the loan. So this was the mentality for financial institutions for years. Is it changing fast enough now?
I think so. I think firstly, there is obviously the risk imperative. So what you're talking about, I mean, there has been enough evidence to see that climate risk is already becoming quite material. I mean, if it hasn't become enough already, there is to look around the physical risk, the transition risk. So there is that risk imperative that financial institutions are looking at. But there is also the opportunities angle, right? Like you're seeing green bonds coming up, you're seeing a lot of sustainable bonds, nature-based solutions, and these are opportunities that the climate movement has actually put in place. So there
So
is
even
that.
financial products are actually progressing.
Absolutely, and you're seeing that across, so yeah.
So, Sheikh, I would come back to you about the financing. And yes, it's also about financial institutions and the role in all of this. So, to what extent do you think that there will come a point where banks and financial institutions will put the priority for green financing rather than the traditional financing, even if it's less profitable for them?
I think the way to answer this question is depends on how the policy is being structured. So if the policy within the country supports incentives for green energy or green sector, then yes, you would see priority being put for green financing or climate financing. If I speak about it from the policy aspect. I think if I speak about the work we do at Masdar, this is something that we actually take into consideration. So when we work with lenders, we need to ensure that the projects we build are not only profitable, but also projects that are socially acceptable to wherever we're building it. The return is well enough to ensure that, as I mentioned, just transition is not only about the social aspect, ensuring that everyone is on board, but it's also ensuring that you have economic stability. So that's how it all comes into play.
So before I open up the stage for our audience to ask questions, one last question for both of you. What would you like to see in COP30? Sheikha, please go ahead.
I think I have to not be biased, but I will. Because I'm leading the Just Transition track. It's a very important track, and we have seen from the Brazilian presidency that they have been prioritizing this track. I think it's about time we see, a big outcome out of that track, and I'm pretty sure we will be ending up with something that is ambitious and also realistic.
Nonita.
I think I'll just have to agree with Shekha because, as I mentioned, I think just transition needs to be the center of all our work in the region or when you're talking about emerging economies. But also the need that we should be looking at, we cannot be looking at climate as one specific piece, but also looking at sustainability in a holistic manner. So looking at how does nature-based solutions kind of align with climate? How do you look at social aspects around with climate? It's very, very critical that we're looking at all of these aspects in a more holistic manner.
Okay, so let's hear from our audience. Any questions for our speakers? We have the first here.
Good evening, speakers, and thank you so much for the amazing work you are doing. I have two questions from both the speakers. First question is, when we set targets at the global level and when they reach the nations and then to the local governments, sometimes these targets can be overwhelming and very ambitious. So most of the results or the activities which we do could be self-reported. How do we avoid greenwashing when we are doing that? And the second question is, when we talk about harmonizing taxonomies, how does that help in tackling the climate change problem?
Thank you. Okay, so I think the green washing issue, I think this is something that Nonita can help us with.
Yeah, I think maybe on the greenwashing part, it's very important that there are definitions in place. And again, the policies kind of become quite important. So when I talk about definitions, we are seeing a lot of organizations, international organizations, actually trying to define what green looks like, what transition, etc., looks like. And that can actually help in terms of ensuring that there's no greenwashing taking place. It obviously becomes quite difficult sometimes because at times what the international standards are saying and even what your national objectives or the national taxonomies could look like are quite different. And therefore, it's important to be having these policy engagements in place between different actors. And maybe just to kind of align that with the second question also you asked. So a taxonomy would be basically ensuring that you are looking at a viable science-based framework that really specifies what sustainable policy, sustainable economic activities looks like for the countries, right? So it's, again, when you're talking about harmonizing it, it's very important that there is alignment from what the different policies or the different taxonomies across the region are looking like or across the globe are looking like, and providing some sort of alignment or alignment between the different taxonomies. So for example, what a taxonomy in India could look like might be very, very different from what a taxonomy in Australia could look like, but there would still be needs to be common element around that so that there is that ability to harmonize and ensure that we are looking at cross-border engagement.
Sheikha, would you like to add anything?
Just the first part of the questions maybe applies to the work that I do more. When it comes to greenwashing and about countries that have limited resources, there are, as I mentioned, this is a party-driven, multilateral process, which means that all parties are engaged in the policy making, and there are mentions within the policy of special circumstances. So you would see special circumstances given to least developed countries, small island developing states, those that are really facing the vulnerabilities of climate change and its consequences. So with that, I also link it to transparency, which is another topic that trickles down all themes within the UNFCCC, is to ensure that the reporting is transparent. So once you meet for the global stocktake, where you get to see the efforts of the past 4 years, you ensure that they're realistic and you know how to tackle them well enough.
Okay, so any other questions? Okay, we have 2 more, so let's start here.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking to us here. One of the questions I have is I've previously worked on nature-based solutions and looking at including social impact into traditionally climate or carbon projects. And a challenge you often feel is like you're shoehorning a lot of issues into the same project, and that causes 2 issues: either the risk of delay, because it causes more checks and balances to be included in the project framework or the financing framework, or the second is the risk of the cost rising quite high because you need a consultant to be able to do those intermediate steps. So maybe the question I have for you is, when, even from a policy perspective or a project perspective, governments or companies are looking at projects, how can they should they fragment or they layer these kind of information for projects, or should it be done in a way that you have any advice to reduce costs and make the process more seamless in your experience?
Please go ahead.
So the thing is, agree with your concern actually quite a bit. And so at UNFFI, we've been really trying to work with the different financial institutions to understand how we can be looking at nature in different types of ways. So one is obviously looking at it from the nature risk perspective, and I think in a sense that has been easier because we have a lot of tools in place, such as the Encore tool. Right now there is more reporting around TNFD, etc., which has come up, which is making this a little bit more streamlined. But when you're talking about it from the product-based side or from the opportunity sides especially, like it has been a lot of challenge, and this is something that we're actually working on right now. So for example, we have something coming up which is called the Nature Preparer Forum, where we are planning to get financial institutions from across, especially LAC as well as APAC, to come together to understand what has been the challenges and try to work around a much more streamlined guideline or methodology when you're talking about nature-based solution. And I think the third thing, and just adding out here actually what you were saying, is in terms of looking at how do you integrate challenges around indigenous populations along with the nature-based work that we are doing. And this is something that a lot of financial institutions have actually been highlighting as quite difficult in place. And so I don't really have any answer to give you, but hopefully soon we would be looking at this in a much more pragmatic
So
manner.
I have 30 seconds more, so I'll take one last question.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for this session. I'm a little bit feminist, so I'm happy to see women around here leading this discussion. I just want to ask, actually, as we are noticing, most of the organizations are already aware of climate change, and they are starting to do their calculation, whether in-house for greenhouse gases, whether in-house or through outside consultants. My question is, should there be a verification from a third-party auditor for these calculations before they are able to set up targets and track their emissions? And are there actually laws that are implemented already efficiently locally here for those companies and organizations to proceed with their calculation and then after that with the verification? Thank you.
I think Sheikha will help us with that.
Yes, so this is a perfect question because I went through my own energy transition. Prior to joining a renewables company, I was working for an oil and gas company. And we used to do scope 3 emissions, tracking greenhouse gas emissions. So you have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And working hands-on on such a project, it's very little for me to say that it's extremely and immensely difficult to be able to not do the double accounting when you try to track your emissions down your supply chain. But the government is very, very engaged in this process. We do have a completely dedicated ministry, the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, ensuring that these calculations and reporting is taken to the MRV initiative that is by the ministry. And you mentioned as well a question about whether or not these need to be verified. These are always absolutely verified. So to ensure that the reporting is transparent.
Thank you so much for such an insightful discussion, and thank you so much for joining us and for all your questions. We wish you a very happy day, and see you again tomorrow. Bye.